To culminate the hottest summer on record for our planet, after killer heat waves, monsoons, forest fires, warming ocean temperatures have Hurricane Florence bearing down on the Carolinas as the typhoon, which goes by the name of Mangot, is battering the Philippines soon. Extreme weather no longer the exception, but the norm, it seems. And you can't just blame Donald Trump. Yes, it is awkward timing that the hurricane's hitting the U.S. the same week that his administration announced the relaxing of curbs on methane gas emissions. But previous U.S. presidents also dragged their heels when it came to policing carbon emissions. Delegates at a 3-day climate summit that's opened in San Francisco know that it's not just the United States that's failing to meet its targets. They're rooting for local government and the private sector to do more. What that means, we'll ask our panel. It also means rethinking how we as citizens live our lives. France's environment minister recently quit a government that he says is all for going green, just so long as it doesn't dent growth. Can we always want more? More money, more stuff. The planet can't afford it. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the brewing storm over extreme weather. Joining us from the Belgian city of Liège, Mohamed Nasheed, former president of the Maldives, founder of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which brings together nations disproportionately affected by the consequences of global warming. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
From Pune in India, Rajendra Shendi, former director at the United Nations Environment Program. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
We welcome back from the French capital, Prague, Bjorn Lomborg, the author of Cool It and skeptical environmentalist, director of the Copenhagen Consensus. Thanks for being with us.
It's good to be back.
And here in the studio, we're joined by Henri Land, Director General of Good Planet, the environmental advocacy group founded by the photographer and documentary maker Yann Arthus Bertrand. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Yann Arthus Bertrand, for those who don't quite picture him, the guy who takes a lot of pictures of the Earth from the sky.
Yeah.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. They've started the evacuations in the Philippines. Typhoon Mangot could hit northeastern Cagayan province on Saturday. It's called a super typhoon. It's packing winds in excess of 200 kilometers an hour. And on the other side of the planet, it's Hurricane Florence, which has slowed in intensity before Friday's expected landfall with the Carolina coast. The flooding, though, could be devastating. Delano de Souza has more.
Homes and businesses boarded up and thousands evacuated. These are just some of the precautions taken as authorities brace for Hurricane Florence to make landfall. In coastal areas of North Carolina, residents are getting a final glimpse of downtown before they're forced to leave.
Well, this is about the worst one for me. Close. I've been through a Cat 1 before.
Yeah, this is the worst one for me. I've been here 10 years, so this is the biggest one for me.
Been here since '84 and living downtown in an old house that's seen a lot.
Forecasters can typically pinpoint where a storm will wreak the greatest havoc, but with weather systems around Florence disappearing, predicting its path has become increasingly murky.
Just because the wind speeds came down, the intensity of this storm came down to a Cat 2, please do not let your guard down. The storm surge forecast associated with this storm has not changed. The ocean is going to start rising along the coast and in the Back Bay and inlet areas and the Sound areas within a matter of hours. Your time to get out of those areas and storm surge inundation is coming to a close.
A state of emergency has already been declared in North and South Carolina, Virginia, as well as Georgia. According to the National Hurricane Center, flooding could reach up to 1 meter in certain areas, and millions are expected to go without power for weeks.
Let me begin with you, Rajendra Shende. Your thoughts on what a crazy summer it's been.
Indeed. But that has been a story for last more than 50 years now. And particularly in the last 25 years, since we had a global protocol first a Kyoto one and then a Paris Climate Agreement. It's not only the weather which is chaotic, I think it's the politics which is chaotic, it's a mindset is chaotic. And we also has been seeing that probably the day will come when we will not only evacuate the people from Philippines or from California, where the fires are raging and the floods are coming, but probably one day we'll see that evacuate the planet. And then we have what is called as a missions ready to take us to, we don't know where. So that is my first reaction.
A few years back, Mohammed Nasheed, you staged a cabinet meeting underwater to draw attention to the fact that your island state could someday be submerged, someday soon. Since that publicity stunt, if we could call it that, the holding that cabinet meeting underwater, how do you think it's gone in terms of awareness?
I see things also in an optimistic light. In 2009, we went to Copenhagen, hoping that there will be a legally binding agreement. When we came to 2009, when we came to Copenhagen, UNFCCC had run a process where countries were trying to find a common denominator on how to protect the environment and the planet. They were arguing very much in the fashion of the World Trade Agreements. If, let's say, two countries agreed to something and a third country came along and didn't agree, what the UNFCCC process was doing was that they brought their ambitions down to the third country's level. So in the sense that you were looking for the lowest common denominator. Copenhagen was a departure from that thinking to say, ask countries to give you ambition. How far can you go? But of course, we did not get a legally binding agreement in Copenhagen. But the idea that countries must brace and must have more ambition in protecting the environment survive. So since then, these ideas migrated to Paris. And then now have this Paris Agreement. We also, at the same time, why we had the Paris Agreement was, my view, that renewable energy had become financially viable. It has become an economic, a profit-making venture.
It's become now we're getting into the nuts and bolts of it, which is figuring out how you pay for it all, and how do you pay for reducing carbon emissions, and how do you pay for the increase in extreme weather. Let me ask you, Bjorn Lundborg, on this point. Last year in the United States, they had two big hurricanes, Maria and Harvey. This year they're bracing for Florence. How do you factor it in? How do you change policy when you have these increased incidences of extreme weather?
Yeah, we kind of.
Can I just first?
A few sentences.
Sorry, you wanted me to answer, right?
Yeah, just one at a time. Mohammed Nasheed, first, let me ask Bjorn Lundborg first. Go ahead.
All right. So, Francois, first of all, I think we just need to take a step back and realize that when you're talking about increasing extreme weather, there are some things. Global warming absolutely is happening. The UN climate panel is telling us we're going to see more extreme precipitation. We're going to see more hot days. But if you look at the most important indicators, the things that really harm the economy, like hurricanes, there has not been an increase. If you look at the total cost of damages in percent of GDP since 1990, it has been declining. If you look at the number of hurricanes hitting the U.S. since 1900, it's been declining. If you look at the number of strong hurricanes hitting the U.S., they've also been declining. So, yes, there is a problem with global warming. But we also need to recognize that we have to get our facts right. Yes, it's really sexy to put up when you have it on TV. And obviously, these hurricanes, you mentioned Harvey and Maria last year, we're seeing Florence this year. Of course, remember, the 11 years before that, no major hurricane hit the US, which is the longest period we've ever seen in modern times since 1900. So again, yes, there is a problem with global warming, but exacerbating it doesn't actually make us make good judgment. Now, sorry, back to your question, how do we pay for it? Fundamentally, we're only going to fix this problem if we can make green energy, and that was Mohammed's point. We're only going to make this happen if we can make green energy so cheap that everyone will want to switch.
Mohammed Nasheed.
Cheap. I mean, green energy is already so cheap. If we can actually price fossil fuel without all the subsidies from government, from tax money, we are not priced accordingly, and it is not market price. Oil price not through the market mechanism.
Mohammed Nasheed, I'm going to interrupt you because we're having audio issues with the line with Bruges, and we'll try to reconnect with you to get a better connection. Apologies for that. Henri Lande, let me ask you to pick up on the point made by Bjorn Lornborg a minute ago. Perception and reality. Coming off a summer where we've had these big, we've had these increase in temperatures, big forest fires in places like California and Sweden. The flooding that took place in Kerala that was deadly from the monsoon, the heat wave, the killer heat waves in South Korea and Japan. Is it anecdotal, or is it the sign of extreme weather that really is on the increase?
I know for a fact from listening to the many, many scientists that talk about the consequences of climate change and the overall tendencies and changes in the weather, that there is a tendency of more and more visible consequences of the fact that greenhouse gas emissions are going into the air because of human activity. I actually don't really care whether or not one hurricane or a few hurricanes are related to that tendency or not, because in general, we have rising temperatures which follow the same curve as the increase of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have an overall warming of the planet, rising sea level, more and more forest fires to deal with. And the truth is that at some point I stop wondering about whether the science is correct when I have so many scientists that are raising this alarm, because I don't think it's sexy for them to explain that very inconveniently our planet is becoming less habitable. What I do think is sexy is once in a while someone coming out and saying it's not true and then putting out a buzz because they're going against the current, which is now so strong, because the fact is we are all in need of changing our economic paradigm. The second reason why I don't care is because when you start to do an energy transition, and that's not the only thing that's necessary, you also need to change your agriculture and food system. You need to change your waste system. You need to change how we move around, not just changing from one energy source to another, but also moving around a little bit differently and less. Once you start doing that, we all live better anyway, and biodiversity can also be preserved. So this whole debate about whether or not we should think that climate change is real and is really that much anthropogenic or not, meaning human-induced, is way behind me. And I only care about keeping this planet habitable for us. And that's not only about energy, and it's not only about climate. It's just, unfortunately, they're all related to the fact that we have an unsustainable economic system. And that means agreeing to change our lifestyles. And we would be all in agreement with it if politicians and companies and citizens all work together towards that. But there are a few reforms to do that are not easy to make.
A few reforms to do. Bjorn Lomborg, you agree?
No. And I think it's rather remarkable. Remember, I'm not saying global warming is not real, but I am saying we should get our facts right. Now, Henri is a little conveniently saying, oh, that's all behind me. Well, I would argue that if we're actually going to embark on something that's going to be phenomenally expensive, and remember, he's not just talking about changing our energy system, but he's talking about changing a lot of other systems too. We better get our facts right first before we just jump into this. And the truth is, and Henri, you got face up to this.
You don't have to jump into it. Well, everybody else will jump into it.
No. Sorry, can I just finish? Thanks. if you look at the cost of extreme weather since 1990, which is the first ones where we have good global data, the cost in percent of GDP has gone down, not up. So you've got to face up to the fact that it's not such that right now global warming is making the planet worse. Yes, there is a problem.
Can I
yes,
come in?
there are things.
There are people who still don't believe that man landed on moon. And it's very difficult to argue that.
I'm not making that point. I'm simply saying we got to get our facts right.
That your fact is first of all, I don't know if your fact is actually correct, but your fact is also among many other facts that are overwhelmingly an argument for changing our economic system. It pretty much makes sense when you look at the correlation between increased greenhouse gas emissions and all of the other tendencies that we're talking about. And whether you're just comparing economic costs of a few hurricanes from 1990 to now, that's not very revealing to me. I don't really understand this whole obsession with getting our facts right when all the other facts are pointing to a very overwhelming problem in our economic system, which is having a lot of public health effects. And it's actually rather offensive to be here on the panel with the president of the Maldives, a country that, like many other small island states, is suffering from these consequences on a day-to-day basis. And basically, we've had global warming for a long time, absolutely, but now we have global warming that is so exacerbated that populations, and because of global inequality, are dealing with it in a much more difficult way. So I just don't see the point in debating with people that put forward facts like this anymore.
Well, exactly.
So you don't see the point
I don't think that this is now the time
facts being put
to be
forward.
talking to
I
people
will be
who
happy to share
do not
this with
believe
you.
that the
You
world
should probably know
is
this.
round.
All right, let me one at a time.
Right.
Mohammed Nasheed.
Go and join it.
Can I come in?
Yeah, go ahead. Rajendra Shende, excuse me, it's a bit unruly with the Skype connections. Rajendra Shende.
Okay, I hope you are able to hear me well.
Loud and clear.
I think the issue is, in India, we have a saying that our population is not 1.3 billion. Our opinions are 1.3 billion. And that's why we have a systematic process of getting a consensus on facts. There is a body called an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which put forward the facts after boiling out, after distilling the thousands of papers, the scientists' opinion, and putting it in every 4 years of reporting back to the government. And those are the facts. And those facts very clearly say that the hurricane, the wildfires, the floods, the landslides, and all those kind of scenarios, though cannot be related one-to-one with the climate change and the global warming, they have been increasing in the frequency and the intensity. And I think the time for debating on the facts and those individual scientists getting those kind of facts, that time is gone.
All right, we're going to pick up on this point when we come back. We have to take a very quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking as a 3-day climate action conference is opening up in San Francisco, California, which this summer saw forest fires, basically send up in smoke the equivalent of twice the size of New York City. With us to talk about it is Mohammed Nasheed, the former president of the Maldives and founder of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which brings together nations disproportionately affected by global warming. He joins us from Liège in Belgium, from Pune in India, Rajendra Shende, former director at the United Nations Environment Program, from the Czech capital Prague, Bjorn Lundberg, author of Cool It and skeptical environmentalist, director of the Copenhagen Consensus, and here in the studio, Henri Land, Director General of Good Planet Environmental Advocacy Group. On the eve of that climate action conference taking place in San Francisco, California's governor, Jerry Brown, signing into law a bill that sets the target for the U.S.'s biggest and most powerful state of only harnessing electricity from clean sources by the year 2045.
The federal government is following a very deviant course of subsidizing coal, sabotaging clean air regulations and other incentives for zero-emission cars. All of this is not what we're trying to do. The opposite. We're trying to promote clean vehicles, clean technology, and a safer, sustainable world. So I guess we're on our own out here.
On our own out here, he says. Henri, first of all, your thoughts about that announcement, because 2045. Well, if you're a politician, right, that's fair enough. That's far enough in the future, so that you probably won't be around to be for that year for the implementation to happen on your own watch. Is that a courageous step, though, taken by the governor of California to announce that?
The energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and more energy efficiency does take time. I think 2045 is a bit long. However, the fifth economic power in the world, which is the state of California, has a lot riding on its energy system. It has a lot riding also on adapting to climate change as well, and so it's not dealing with a set of easy challenges right now. I do hope and do think that California, as it engages this transition from some fossil fuel and some nuclear to renewable energy and energy efficiency, and using nuclear as a transition energy, I do think that it will have positive retroactive effects, meaning that once you get into that curve, you get that investment going, you could see more exponential growth of green energy and of energy efficiency technologies and ways of life, meaning that we could actually go much faster. What he says about California being all alone, that's a little bit of a political statement, in my opinion, trying to reinforce that contrast with Donald Trump's position and saying, listen, the rest of the international community, you can count on California. California is now an interlocutor at the world stage, at the international stage, for negotiating and getting things done on climate change, which is very interesting. It also shows the decentralization of the United States, which in this case is a positive step for fighting climate change, because obviously the federal government is not putting forward very ambitious positions, to say the least. But I do think that it is true. It is stalling things a little bit, unfortunately, even for California, that the rest of the country won't be on board like it was 3 years ago.
Rajendra Shende, your thoughts?
Well, I think what California has been doing for the last few decades is exemplary. There is no doubt about it. I think California has done the maximum, probably the most in policy setting as well as implementation of it than any other state in the United States or even any other country in the world. So to that extent, California stands out, no doubt about it. But I think you touched upon the time taken for doing something which is needed to be done to stop this catastrophe. And when you talk about 2045, I mean, we have been hearing a lot of things in California. We are talking about 100% renewable energy by 2040, then having electrical vehicles by 2030, and all those kind of things. I think there has to be a total review of pronouncement and the proclaiming and the actual situation on the ground. We really look at California as somebody or some state who can be example for all other countries, developed or developing countries. And I don't think California has come out like that. I don't want to underestimate their efforts, but I think we looked at California as somebody who will come out with a grand example of implementation. It looks like Jerry Brown is trying to fill in the gap which Trump has created, or the crack which have been formed, and trying to raise the ambition. But we don't know what extent it will go. There is one more point which I want to make before I close it, that there is a process through the Paris Climate Agreement. And now we have an initiative by Jerry Brown. I'm not saying that they are conflicting, but there has to be some kind of convergence. If you lag behind in implementing or operationalizing the Paris Climate Agreement and go ahead with the California's initiative, it may look like a two-way traffic or going in the same direction, but one is going slow and other is going fast, and that particular traffic is pretty small as compared to the global challenge that we face.
But Mohammed Nasheed, let me ask you, because we're getting conflicting word. It's not just about Donald Trump, this issue, and we're getting conflicting word here in Europe about how we're doing in meeting the pledges that were set out back in 2015 at the Paris Climate Change Summit. Some reports say that Germany's on target. Some say they're ahead. Some say they're behind Germany, which is the #1 economy in Europe. Here in France, a report came out a week ago saying that the French are not keeping up with their pledges when it comes to carbon reduction. What are you seeing?
Well, I have always had the view that climate change should not be only an ethical issue. It must be an economic. It must be economically viable, or rather, renewable energy must be economically viable and financially feasible. When we were in government in 2009, we announced the Maldives to become carbon neutral by 2020. Then most people thought I was mad. They never believed we could produce electricity from renewables cheaper than we were generating it with diesel and coal. But 9 years later, what a difference that 9 years has made. Solar and battery hybrid systems now will produce electricity cheaper than diesel on every inhabited island in the Maldives. There is a low carbon development strategy. Renewables are far cheaper and far economically more viable. If batteries follow solar panels and fall in price, then distributed energy systems could be transformative. This will have a huge relevance, especially for developing countries that don't have big electricity grids. We probably wouldn't bother building big electricity grids. But has Germany, France, and other developed countries reached their ambitions, reached their targets? Now, I have again on this thought that this should not be an argument between developed and developing countries. Developing countries cannot be saying that the West had emitted carbon for the last 500 years, and therefore we now should have a right to do the same. It's like saying that the West has driven us to the cliff, and then the developing countries, now emerging economies, should have the right to push us off the cliff. This is madness. There is a low carbon development strategy, and we must be exploring that strategy. You can have economic growth, you can have high employment, low inflation, and so on and so forth, through other development patterns and paths. Renewable energy being one of the most important, and California, of course, is showing that. The feed-in tariff system in Germany brought the price of solar panels down so rapidly, and especially when China started mass producing it. Now, in any given situation, solar is actually cheaper than diesel. So countries will reach their ambition, reach their targets when this becomes an economic issue.
When it becomes economically viable. Bjorn Lomborg,
it is now economically viable.
It is now economically viable, you're saying. Bjorn Lomborg, let me ask you, do you agree?
No. Two things. Because we had the conversation before, we should use the UN climate panel, because we were talking about whether hurricanes are increasing, and we absolutely all agree we should use the IPCC. I just spent the time to get the quote from the UN climate panel.
About this.
No,
I
sorry.
really think that is nonsense.
Let me just finish. This is the quote from the UN climate panel.
About the facts.
Current
The
data
facts
sets
there.
indicate no significant observed
Come
trends
off it.
in
I really
global
do not want to be
tropical
in this
cyclone
debate.
frequency over the past century. So let's just set that aside and just remind ourselves that right now we're not actually seeing an increase. We probably will.
This is an absolutely useless input in this debate. I just have to say, this is just utterly useless.
Gentlemen, let's talk about the economics. Let's talk about.
I really do not want to be arguing with my 4-year-old child.
Yeah, let's
let's
move it on. We had this
input
discussion
from
in part one. In part one, Bjorn, the question is,
No, come
what do
on,
we do
because
going
we cannot
forward?
be arguing on this useless.
The cost is actually higher. That's why we still have to subsidize solar and wind globally. It's probably true in the Maldives because it's very expensive to
But
get
you are
diesel to these
subsidizing
islands. So
fossil fuel far more than
but
anything.
fundamentally, it is very costly, which is why we're spending about $140 billion in subsidies to solar and wind. And the the International Energy Agency,
do you know the amount of subsidies on fossil fuel? How much you would have to pay after the
one at a time. One at a time. First Bjorn Lundberg, and then Mohammed Nasheed, or else we won't be able to. The viewers can't be able to hear.
I honestly don't think the viewers of this
I promise you, Mohammed, you'll have your chance. First Bjorn.
So the International Energy Agency is telling us that even by 2040, we will only have less than 4% of the global energy supply supplied by solar and wind. So no, this is not going to happen. When we have all these magnificent promises, let's just remember we've had lots of promises before, both from states and from non-state actors. There's a famous study that showed back in Johannesburg in 2002, there were more than 300 promises by non-state actors saying, we are going to cut our carbon emissions. 10 years later, when you reviewed them, it turned out 65% of these promises had not even begun to be operationalized. In a study last year,
I would like to come in.
I really think that, coming out with all these wrong figures and cooked up
we
figures,
were not seeing
useless.
most of these being implemented. So unfortunately, yes, there's lots of hype, but we're not actually going to see a dramatic change until we get green energy to be much, much cheaper, which requires a lot more research and development. Fundamentally, only then are we going to see a dramatic reduction in carbon emissions.
All right, Mohammed Nasheed.
I would like to come in.
And then Rajendra.
Thank you.
Renewable energy is already far cheaper than fossil fuel. After this hurricane, which is being caused by climate change, you will see how much you will be paying in insurance. You will see the cost of it. You will have to add that into your fossil fuel price. And even without that,
I agree. We should have a carbon tax.
Even without that, in any given situation now, it's 14 cents to produce an electricity unit through renewables, while it is 27 cents to produce it through diesel. I mean, it's very obvious now. This is not
but
rocket
the world
science
is not
anymore.
producing most electricity with diesel. This is
not rocket. Well, okay, then go for coal. Go for any other fossil fuel. Recently in India, very recently in India, for a tender, the renewable energy bid was cheaper than the coal bid. Please understand this.
I want to bring in Rajendra Shende on this, because Rajendra, right now we're in a situation where the price of oil has gone up globally. You've elections coming up in India soon, and it's become a bit of a campaign issue because fuel subsidies were slashed by the Indian government, and now that the price of oil is creeping up, there are protests.
That's true. I think let me retract a bit. I think we talked about the economics of it. Just because the renewables and other decarbonization methods are costly doesn't mean that we should not undertake it, or we should just keep it aside. I think the situation is so catastrophic that we have to find a way, even if it is slightly costly. It remains to be seen that why certain things are less costly, but still the world is not doing it. The example is solar energy. Now the solar energy tenders, solar energy cost is going down, and it's even profitable as compared to the oil and the coal, mainly with the coal, is because of the technology revolution. But it is not spreading fast, and it is not spreading fast because of promises and a proclamation that has been made by the leaders of the government, and those who are leading the policies are not kept. Now, we heard just now what percentage of promises are not being kept. So the our effort should be to see that those promises are kept.
Efforts should be seen that the promises are kept.
Yeah, the whole Paris Climate Agreement is based on promises, and it's on pledges. And if you say that you cannot keep the promises and pledges, then we give up on this debate. Then we just face the consequences and don't do anything. That is the best thing to do.
Let me ask you at this point about the conversation here in France, because we had that spectacular resignation live on air a couple of weeks back of the environment minister, a very popular figure, probably the most popular in Emmanuel Macron's cabinet. Nicolas Hulot is his name. He rued how the French government one day talks climate change and then the next celebrates big industry projects, like the christening last week of that new French super tanker in the port of Le Havre. Is it a mindset in France, or is it just simply that, it's what the public wants? The public wants growth. And sustainable growth, well, that's not good enough. Everybody wants a pay increase. Everybody wants more stuff.
I'm not sure everybody wants more stuff and a pay increase. Obviously, everybody wants to have the salary that's high enough to be able to live well and not only satisfy their needs, but have leisure time, spend time with their families, be able to travel. Economists show that once you get above a certain salary level, your happiness doesn't necessarily go much higher. The fact is that the French government does have an ambitious discourse on climate change and fighting climate change, has filled a void internationally because Donald Trump and other world leaders, even in Australia, Canada, have not been as ambitious as they could have been. And there is a little bit of an incoherence in how the French government is acting in the concrete measures that it acted in over the last couple of years, particularly on sustainable agriculture, which is not moving fast enough, and that was one of Nicolas Hulot's biggest points. He also was saying that it's a mindset, like you're saying, about not just thinking climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and uniting people to talk about investments in renewable energy and stuff. That's important. But it's also about not signing trade deals that continue to promote making products travel all over the world so that they can land into consumers' hands, products that not necessarily are necessary, nor necessary that it was produced so far away.
That radical change in our mindset has not happened, though.
It has happened in the minds of some, like Nicolas Hulot. It has not happened in the minds of everybody. And yes, there is probably a very structural change that needs to happen in the next elections in France and in other countries where you decide that, okay, now transferring from a very high growth in a classical sense, lots of material production, lots of liberal trade and free trade, lots of traveling by plane, lots of fossil fuel energy. All of that needs to transfer into a system where we're relocalizing a lot of the economic production, food, material, and manufactured goods, and deciding that we should invest much more heavily with the money that we do have out of fossil fuel. And to counter what was being said earlier, there are tremendous subsidies in fossil fuels, and taking that out and putting it all into renewable energy and deciding this is our strategy for the next 5 years, and we're not faltering from it.
Greenpeace putting out a study that shows that we still subsidize energy here in Europe with 58 billion euros in hidden subsidies in
fossil fuel,
in backup power sources known as capacity mechanism. The good news is it keeps our utility bills down. The bad news is it keeps our utility bills down. Because fossil fuel and nuclear energy are propped up by these capacity mechanisms, their price is kept artificially low. This penalizes renewable energy, says Greenpeace, and distorts the market. Bjorn Lomborg, the mindset has not changed, says Greenpeace. Do you agree?
Well, I think for many people around the world, obviously, they would like to actually be pulled out of poverty. But I think, notice how the conversation shifted from saying, oh, we can actually afford green energy, it's going to be cheap, it's actually cheaper. If it really was cheaper, we wouldn't have a problem, everyone would switch. But then suddenly the conversation goes, we have to, do with less. We have to say enough is enough. We have to, have stay-home vacations and do a lot of other things in order to deal with the climate. Now, both points are fair, but you can't have both at the same time. Fundamentally, unfortunately, green energy still isn't competitive. There's a huge conversation to be had about the subsidies on fossil fuels. There are absolutely subsidies in third world countries, and I absolutely agree we should get rid of them. They've done so in Indonesia, for instance, and it's a good thing fundamentally for the country. But let's not kid ourselves. This is not what's going to get us onto a dramatic green path. It will reduce carbon emissions some, and that's great. But if we're going to reduce carbon emissions much more, we will need much better green energy. Fundamentally, it doesn't help that solar is cheaper than coal, which it is only some places. If it's only true when the sun is shining, you also need to have the backup power. And as long as we don't have that solved, at least in an economic fashion, we're still stuck. So yes, your problem and your question is absolutely right. We're not going to get this by asking everyone to change their mindset. What we are going to do this is through technology that will make green energy so cheap that everyone will want to switch. And then, of course, we won't need these sorts of promises and constant failures that we've seen in Kyoto and
me neither.
Rajendra Shende.
I don't agree on that.
Can I? A challenge for politicians.
Can I go ahead?
Who is speaking?
All right, one at a time. Rajendra and then Mohammed Nasheed.
Yeah. Okay, Rajendra.
That's
please.
right. We started talking about Nicola Hulot, and we talked about mindset, and then we are coming back again to the renewable energy economics of it. So our debate is getting chaotic. I would like to say something that Nicola Hulot's exit from the government has been blow not only to the French government, but for the whole climate change debate. The issue is like this. The issue is the mindset. We are not talking about changing it only for the citizens. We are also talking about changing the mindset of the politicians, of the ministers, and of the government and the cabinets. I think when the Nicola Hulot came into the government, his mindset was an activist. Now, knowing that he is in a government, he should have said that now his mindset should be to get everybody along and try to see what are the basic problems in it. Now, for example, one of the basic problems is that the fossil fuel industry is still subsidized. About 100 billion direct subsidies are given by the developed country for the fossil industry. And that makes the solar uneconomical, even if technology-wise and commercial-wise.
I'm going to interrupt you because we're almost out of time, and I want to get Mohammed Nasheed's word on this. Is it better to be and your thoughts on how politically you should go about things? Do you agree with Rajendra that minister was wrong to slam the door of the government?
Well, a challenge for politicians is to find a way to deal with the growing threat from climate change, while also, I think, revitalizing our economies and ensuring that our politics doesn't become extremist. See, we need to fix our climate, our economics, and our politics. I think the key question that will dominate the next few decades is, can we find a way to slash greenhouse gas emissions, adapt to higher temperatures, while also generating inclusive economic growth? There are, many, many powerful trends that we can predict. That's the economic argument that we have gone into. So I think what the French minister had done or not done, this would be a continuous issue coming into politics from now on. We should be looking at a low-carbon development strategy that would have the same economic outcomes of high growth, high wages, and so on, but through different paths and different paths.
Different paths. Aim high is what you're saying. Mohammed Nasheed, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Liège in Belgium. I want to thank Rajendra Shende for being with us in Pune in India. Bjorn Lornborg in Prague. Henri Land here in the studio. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.